All right, we'll give it another 15 seconds or so, but I'll get started. So I just wanted to say thank you everyone for joining. We have a big crowd today. Um, Welcome to the Belfer Center Intelligence Project and Cyber Projects event on the SolarWinds Orion hack. Today we have a few ground rules. The chat function will be disabled. When it's time for Q&A at the end, please type your question into the Q&A box and we'll go through. With that being said, I'll turn it over to Paul Colby and Lauren Zaberick for brief introductions.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. Welcome, everybody. Delight to be here with this really distinguished and entertaining panel. I lead the Intelligence Project at Harvard's Belfer Center. And we have a couple of main missions. One is to help demystify intelligence issues, topics, careers for both a Harvard audience and a wider public audience. And we particularly try to focus on an exploration of the nexus between intelligence and policymaking. How do you have better informed both intelligence producers and better informed and better intelligence consumers? Here today to talk about the SolarWinds Orion attack. I think it's one of the seminal events in cyber history and will be noted as such for a couple of reasons. And a couple of things I just point out very quickly. One is that there's been a huge spectrum of descriptions of this particular event. People have called it an attack. People have called it a hack. People have called it an act of war. People have said it's only an espionage operation. And I think none of those terms that we're using really describe both this incident and the phenomenon that we're seeing. And the phenomena that we're seeing is that we're living in an age of ambient cyber conflict. There's cyber operations, cyber attacks, cyber reconnaissance taking place constantly across our networks and across the globe in an invisible act of sort of both spy, counter spy, and force against force. And I think that as we look at the SolarWinds incident and operation, what we see is this represents less of a tip of an iceberg of this cyber activity that's taking place, but really represents for me the tip of a shark fin. Right, so we see the shark fin surface. We know that there's danger there, but what we don't see are all the other sharks circling underneath the surface. And we've got a panel today to talk about those other sharks that are circling, what those sharks are eating, and how we might best defend against some of those sharks. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about the specific facts of SolarWinds. What happened? How did it happen? Why did it happen? And what the implications are for us going forward. And not just for the government, where much of the focus has been on the impact of the attack on government agencies, but on what I think are the much more profound implications of the impact on private sector, on the companies that use this software and inadvertently imported, uploaded the malware that was contained in the SolarWinds software. So with that, I'll turn over to Lauren Zaberick. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this event today, held by both the Intelligence Project and the Cyber Project. So my project, the Cyber Project, is really focused on exploring different aspects of cyber policy. And our driving vision is cybersecurity is national security. And really that encompasses everything from international aspects to it, norms, agreements, et cetera, all the way to our defensive domestic posture as well. And so we've actually been doing a lot of work over the last year, investigating how we can improve our cyber resilience through collective defense and cyber threat intelligence analysis and sharing. We recently published an op-ed, Paul and I, in the Cypher Brief detailing our thoughts, not only from an operational perspective, but also from a technological and an organizational one. There's so many areas that we aim to address in our work, and we aim to release a strategy document by the end of the semester that will, provide a roadmap to that improved posture. But clearly, cyber defense is an important issue for us both at Intel and Cyber Projects, and that's why we've convened this panel together. The SolarWinds operation offers us the opportunity to think about these issues not only in theory, but also in practice. And so here today is a very distinguished panel to talk through what we know through the lens of how we might improve our defensive cyber posture, be that through policy, norm setting, the economics of it, intelligence, and even military operations. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, but I do want to just highlight upfront a quick admin note that unfortunately Priscilla Moriucci had to drop out today due to an emergency, but we are so grateful to have Bruce Schneier to step in at the last minute. So he is rounding out our panel today. So I will go through each of our panelists. First, we have Dr. Erica Borgard, who's a resident senior fellow with the New American Engagement Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. She also serves as a senior director on the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Previously, Erica was an assistant professor at the Army Cyber Institute at United States Military Academy at West Point. Prior to that, Erica was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow with placement at JP Morgan Chase and U.S. Cyber Command. She also served as assistant professor and executive director of the Rupert H. Johnson Grand Strategy Program in the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. She received her PhD in political science from Columbia University, and she's a team member at the Council on Foreign Relations and an adjunct research fellow at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia. Next, we have Camille Stewart, who is an attorney whose cross-cutting perspective on complex cyber, technology, and national security and foreign policy issues has landed her in significant roles at leading government and private sector companies like the Department of Homeland Security, Deloitte, and Google. Camille is now head of the Security Policy and Election Integrity for Google Play and Android, where she leads cybersecurity, privacy, election integrity, and misinformation policy efforts. Prior to Google, Camille managed cybersecurity, election security, tech innovation, and risk issues at Deloitte, and she was appointed by President Barack Obama as the Senior Policy Advisor for Cyber Infrastructure and Resilience Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. She was the Senior Manager of Legal Affairs at Cyvalence, a cybersecurity company, after working on Capitol Hill. She is also a non-resident fellow here at the Belfer Center Cyber Project. Next, we have David Sanger, who is an adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy School and a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He is a national security correspondent and a senior writer at the New York Times. In a 36-year reporting career for the Times, he has been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. His newest book, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, was published in 2018, and it examines the emergence of cyber conflict as the primary way that large and small states are competing and undercutting each other, changing the nature of global power. And I also, he does have a documentary on HBO, which I started watching last night, now that I have some time to watch TV. And finally, last but not least, certainly not least, we have Bruce Schneier, who is an internationally renowned public interest technologist working at the intersection of security, technology, and people. He is a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center, as well as a fellow here at the Belfer Center. He's a board member of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the chief security architect at Interrupt Inc. He is author of 14 books, including the New York Times bestseller Data and Goliath: The Hidden Battles to Collect Your Data and Control Your World, as well as hundreds of articles, essays, and academic papers. His influential newsletter, Cryptogram, and blog, Schneier on Security, are read by over 250,000 people. So thank you all for being here. We're very excited to jump into some questions. Just as a reminder, as we go through our questions, we will open it up to Q&A towards the end, and please use the Q&A chat function as Caitlin indicated. Okay, so first, Bruce, I'd love to ask you, just to kind of, bring us back to the basics. Can you sort of walk us through what an APT, an advanced persistent threat, is? Especially the reconnaissance piece, and why SolarWinds was such an attractive target, even if the work upfront was substantial, to actually do that targeting.
The APT is the term we use for advanced persistent threat, which we separate from a criminal threat. It is usually a government actor. It is someone who wants you. So a criminal might want to steal credit card information because they want to make money. They don't care which credit cards they steal. Right? It could be anybody. But an APT wants your credit card. For whatever reason, you are the target. and that is most often a government target. Now, someone like North Korea engages in cybercrime, they will do criminal attacks, but Russia, China, Iran, they're looking for specific intelligence or attack objectives. And that's what we call an APT. This SolarWinds attack is probably the largest APT attack we've seen, the largest operation. And now calling it SolarWinds seems to be somewhat of a misnomer. That is the first attack vector we learned about, but it turns out it's much larger. Company Malwarebytes is reporting that probably about a third of the victims of this SolarWinds attack weren't attacked via SolarWinds. But what SolarWinds Orion is a piece of network infrastructure. So instead of attacking you directly, I'm going to attack something you use. Because maybe you're well defended. You're the State Department, Homeland Security, Treasury. You're another government around the world. You're a major corporation. So you might have good cybersecurity defenses, but all your suppliers probably don't. And SolarWinds is an infrastructure supplier. 300,000 customers worldwide, and one with poor cybersecurity for a whole bunch of reasons we can talk about later. So they were an attractive target for a threat actor who wants to go after their customers. So what the Russian SVR did, they infiltrated SolarWinds update server. We all know that we download updates, we install updates. That's how we get security. They were able to insert a backdoor vulnerability into an update, and then 17 plus thousand SolarWinds Orion customers dutifully downloaded that update, installed it on their network, and became vulnerable. Now, of course, if you are the SVR, you cannot attack 17,000 targets. That's way too many. And then you pick and choose, and this now becomes a much more conventional operation. And we're learning a lot more what the attackers did once they got that initial entree into the network. And we can talk about that more later as well.
Great, thank you. Camille, we're talking about this particular operation as a supply chain threat, for this one particular software vendor. But can you kind of talk more broadly, like what is a supply chain threat, and really why is this sort of a big deal, for our nation in general?
Yeah, so to Bruce's point, SolarWinds is plugging into networks for their customers to serve up dashboards. They're a network monitoring tool that helps you protect your network. So a lot of companies and organizations are using it to get a view across. And since their resilience is strong, it is much easier to plug into something like SolarWinds that gets access to all of your networks, which are then connected to other things like Office 365, which is a piece of the Malwarebytes breach that Bruce was talking about. And you can get a view across networks, across organizations, lay in wait, investigate targets, and do a lot of things. So supply chain attacks are when you attack a downstream vendor whose security might not be as strong as yours. That downstream vendor has a view across a number of companies. They are trusted by you, or at least relied upon by you. You don't have much control over their security practices. Good security says you do upload and use a software update. So you're going to listen to them when they send you a new update that they deem as trusted. And it's an easy way to infiltrate your system. And why this is complicated is that software and technology, the entire digital supply chain, are very opaque. Most companies, most organizations do not know where every component in a hardware system or from software are originate, or who's injected code into them. So for software, so much software is open source. You take a piece from this person, a piece from that person, and you pull it together to create the thing that you want to create. And while that sharing, makes for light work and is helpful, if you are not thorough about reviewing your code, if you don't understand everything that's in it, there's a large opportunity that somebody has inserted maybe 2 to 6 lines of code that can cause something like this. I believe this was 6 lines of code. Same thing with your technology, a small chip that definitely has utility, or maybe it doesn't, inserted into your technology that you don't know is coming from a foreign nation, a malicious actor, could be a command and control equipment that can, infiltrate your network and then be turned into something else. And so supply chain threats are really problematic because we have not built a technology infrastructure, a software infrastructure that demands that we understand what is in our network, what is in our systems, what is in our software. And so everyone is vulnerable for that reason. There's not enough trust in the world at this point for us to be able to effectively understand our networks. And so as we look towards how do we solve this, a big part of that is creating transparency within our supply chain and creating some accountability. That liability structure scares a lot of companies because it's going to be really tough to go back. And so maybe it's not about going back, and we could talk more about the policy options in the next question or later, but we are going to have to demand some transparency and some accountability around supply chain if we want to make meaningful change here.
Thanks, Camille. On that note, since you brought that piece up, Bruce, I might kick it back to you, because you've done a lot of writing on this and sort of like the economics of the internet and basically how these companies are incentivized. Can you talk about that a little bit in this issue?
So we're living in a world where security really isn't something companies are judged on. The market doesn't reward security. The market rewards speed, it rewards features, it rewards price. It doesn't reward quality, it doesn't reward security, reliability, resilience, really any of those things. Largely what Camille said, it's opaque. It's very hard as a consumer. A consumer as a home personal consumer or as a corporate consumer, what it is you're buying. It's a very opaque market. And also it's something where the vendors take a risk. So SolarWinds is a really interesting example. They are a private equity owned company. Thoma Brava, a billionaire, owns much of SolarWinds. And the business model of this private equity company is to pull as much cost out of the system as possible to increase near-term profits. And you read about SolarWinds that security advisors quit because they weren't being listened to. A few years ago, they had, I'm not making this up, password 123 as their password for their update server. I mean, terrible security practices. We learned yesterday that another vulnerability in SolarWinds, completely separate from what the Russians had, are being used by the Chinese to infiltrate other customers. But this lack of security is actually a feature. It's by design. So what SolarWinds is doing is they are reducing costs, increasing risk, and then pushing risk onto their customers without those customers' knowledge or consent. That's the business model here. And it's really strong in these private equity companies because that's what they do. But you also see it in Microsoft. You also see it in other breaches. Equifax, I mean, underspent on security, lots of risk to their users, but not in their business model. So there's a real breakdown here because the buyers can't make intelligent buying decisions on security. It's a risk. It's not an actual thing. So it's easy to slough off. SolarWinds can easily say, we're going to make more money this year, near-term profits, stock goes up. Breach happens in a couple of years, not our problem. So there really is some fundamentals in our system that make these things much more likely.
Definitely, and then you also have, I think, a lot of, from the research that we've done and interviews that we've done, a lot of barriers, to actually, share that information and, for, say, government and private sector to actually work together. And, that's some of the work that we're doing to investigate those barriers and hopefully to bring them down. So, we've sort of laid out, kind of what happened, why this event was, so impactful. I'd love to now kick it over to David to talk about, the actual, there's the strategy of this attack and really the spectrum of activities between, cyber espionage and cyber attacks. So we have this, very vulnerable attack surface, I guess you could say, in the US. And as both Camille and Bruce talked about, it's very opaque. So then on the other side, we have nation states wanting to conduct espionage to, sort of map our systems. David, can you talk a little bit about those activities and then also, what that means within the context of cyber norms too?
Great. Well, first, Lauren, thanks for having me. It's great to be back here. I was among the early group in on the creation of the Cyber Initiative, and it's really great to see conferences like this get going and all you've done with it. So there are a few things that fascinate me about SolarWinds, and Bruce and Camille have touched on some of them. But as you suggest, the state-on-state element of it is really interesting. So the first question is, assuming the Russians did this, which US intelligence has now publicly said they believe that these were Russian actors. They didn't say the Russian government. What was the purpose? Was it simply to do espionage? In which case, if it was, this is a brilliant way in. It's a lot of work to go in and try to fool people into giving you their passwords. You got to stay around late at night. You got to be watching social activity back and forth. But if you could get into SolarWinds and into the update, you don't need to go to all that trouble, because once SolarWinds is in, you can once you are into the systems through the update, you are basically behind the wall. And that gives a very easy way to get into emails, other traffic, without necessarily having any specific passwords. But we don't know, other than the assurance that so far the only activity we've seen has been espionage, that espionage was really what the Russians were up to here. It may be that this was just about information collection. But every significant cyber attack we have seen, Stuxnet, the American and Israeli attack on Iran centrifuges, the Iranian attack on Sands Casino, the North Korean attacks on Sony, they all begin as information collection, right? You go in, you try to break into things, you see what's there. And then phase 2 or phase 3 may be the actual destructive attack. And so that one of the big questions about SolarWinds is this it? Have we seen the activity, or have we just seen phase 1? And one of the reasons I'm suspicious about that is just what Bruce mentioned. If in fact you believe that 30% of the attacks came through methods other than going into the SolarWinds platform, then it's very possible we just discovered SolarWinds first, but that isn't the only and maybe not even the biggest way in. So why would we assume that we know what the ultimate objective here is? The second really interesting question that it brings up is, did the Russians design this to make their way around American defenses? Think about it. The NSA has the ability to go look in foreign systems. And in fact, with Defend Forward and persistent engagement, they are supposed to go in and see attacks brewing. In fact, in this case, they missed it. They didn't actually see any of this activity, which began in March, until FireEye alerted them in December. Why not? Well, once the Russians got into SolarWinds, which is based in Austin, and were through that system, and then once they sent the command and control servers that they set up so that they're inside SolarWinds, they get in a system, they force that system to go reach out to a command and control center, they put those command and control centers in the United States. They put them on GoDaddy. They put them on Amazon. What does that mean? That they knew the NSA was not legally able to go track them inside the US. And they were betting that DHS and the FBI, which can look at them inside the US, were going to miss the signals here. And that turned out to be right until FireEye came along. The third interesting element of all of this is that once that FireEye and Microsoft began to go identify this, what did we discover? As Bruce suggested, they weren't trying to get into all 18,000 companies and agencies that used Orion. They were very selective. They went in by hand to specific targets. This is a very labor-intensive effort. We've had some intelligence reports, some of which have been disputed inside the cyber world, that this may have taken 1,000 people operating on it. We don't know for sure yet, but certainly its size and the selectivity tells you that the Russians must have had something bigger in mind than merely reading emails. Now, to your last question, which is, what does it tell us about cyber norms? If this is just an espionage operation, we're going to have a hard time as a country getting on our high horse about this. Paul has written very persuasively on this topic. We all do espionage. Instead, we have people running around calling it an attack. Well, if it's merely espionage, it's probably not really an attack, but the phrase is used pretty loosely. If it is something deeper, then of course, we may well want to set up some kind of norms around prohibiting this kind of activity. But then we have to decide what we're willing to give up. Because the fact of the matter is, the United States does supply chain attacks too. Stuxnet, Olympic Games was the code name, was a supply chain attack. The American effort to get into the North Korean missile programs and the Iranian missile programs were supply chain attacks. So I'm not even sure, even if we concluded that this was supply chain and that it was awful and that it hit American agencies and corporate America, that the US would be willing to sign up to a norm that says no supply chain attacks.
Interesting stuff. You definitely raise a number of points, and I think it's a great segue into what Dr. Borgard can talk about here on this panel. Dr. Borgard, you've talked a lot about defend forward, persistent engagement, and I think there are a lot of people wondering, and you've answered this before, but wondering, was this a failure of Cybercom's operational strategy of defend forward? So I'd love if you can give your thoughts on that.
Sure, Lauren. And I think I echo David's excellent points about the challenges of adversaries leveraging U.S. controlled infrastructure and the implications for defend forward. But I think that I find it interesting that there have been a number of different sort of variations on the general argument that SolarWinds is an example of the failure of defend forward. And I think a lot of them are sort of misguided or based on sort of misunderstandings about what the concept is. And so, I think it's entirely understandable because I don't think the government has done a great job in communicating about what the strategy actually is. And you've seen a lot of sort of inconsistency, both like not only in statements by sort of senior leaders, but also across different official sort of strategy documents about defend forward. So you have, during the Trump administration, you have the national cyber strategy that doesn't mention the concept at all. You have the cyber command vision that came out before the DoD, the 2018 DoD cyber strategy. And the command vision is oriented around this idea of persistent engagement. And then comes the DoD cyber strategy that talks about defend forward. And you have kind of this confusion about whether these are the same thing or different. It's sort of eventually clarified when General Nakasone testifies that persistent engagement is how Cyber Command implements the DoD's concept of defend forward. But what you're left with is a lot of confusion. And so you know, I don't know that anyone can give you a sort of perfect summary of what that concept is, but I'm happy to share sort of what my take on it is, and you all can take that for what it's worth. But I think if you take the DoD cyber strategy document, the summary that was released in 2018, sort of at its word, the basic premise of Defend Forward is that cyber forces, DoD, military forces, should be able to maneuver outside of blue space, which is a term that the military likes to use to refer to sort of US controlled cyberspace, in what is called gray space, which is sort of neutral cyberspace, and red space, which is adversary controlled cyberspace. These are not great terms, but it's what we're working with. And the general idea is that this is done for two purposes. The first, which I would argue is more routine, is kind of gaining better information about adversary capabilities, about their TTPs, and then under certain conditions, sharing that information with different types of stakeholders, whether it's in the federal government, the private sector, international partners, and so on. And then sort of the second part of Defend Forward, which has gotten, I think, a lot more attention because it's more exciting, is the sort of counter cyber operations to disrupt, deny, and degrade adversary offensive cyber capabilities and infrastructure. And I think my understanding of sort of the genesis of that concept is that it's meant to sort of fill in the gap where cyber deterrence has so far failed. So while the US has sort of successfully deterred cyber attacks that would rise to a threshold of violence or really significant strategic consequences, there's this whole range of malicious activity that takes place below that threshold that we haven't really figured out the right deterrence tools for. And so Defend Forward kind of comes in there. And so, in my understanding, the deterrence and Defend Forward are sort of not interchangeable concepts, even though they sort of are used interchangeably, along with persistent engagement. So you have a lot of confusion. So where does that leave us with SolarWinds and Defend Forward? I think they're generally, three sort of different arguments about SolarWinds as a Defend Forward failure. I think the first one is that, Defend Forward sort of caused Russia to try to get back at the US, and SolarWinds is an example of that. So this is the idea that, well, the US is now becoming sort of more assertive in cyberspace, and that this is kind of triggering some type of escalatory spiral or tit for tat response. I'm a bit skeptical of this because, I think that Russia is likely, and other sort of adversaries and competitors, including the United States, as David mentioned, are kind of likely to do these types of things regardless. So I find sort of making that causal argument a bit implausible. I think the second argument about SolarWinds is that it was a failure of deterrence by cost imposition, which kind of Defend Forward is sometimes argued as being a manifestation of. But I think there's sort of two problems with that line of reasoning. The first is that, if we accept that SolarWinds was espionage, I understand that we still don't yet have enough information about whether or not that was the case. We don't really aim to deter espionage. And even if it was a supply chain attack, as David mentioned, I'm not sure that we would all want to collectively agree to a norm against doing these types of things. So I don't think that's quite the right fit. And also sort of Defend Forward is not interchangeable with deterrence. So I don't think SolarWinds is a failure of deterrence by way of a failure of Defend Forward by way of a failure of deterrence. And then finally, I think the most prevalent argument, which David touched on, is that, given that Defend Forward has this vision of cyber forces maneuvering in gray and red space to understand the adversaries and, potentially conduct counter cyber operations, then shouldn't Cybercom have been able to catch Russia in the act and, thwart the operation before it materialized? And I think the problem is that, Russian threat actors, much of the activity was happening in blue space, right? In US controlled cyberspace, in networks that are controlled by private actors, not even the government. And so the challenge here is that cyber mission forces are simply not trying to locate the adversary there because there are extremely limited, appropriately so, authorities for doing that. I think you can make the argument that perhaps CMS operators should have been able to sort of locate the source ranges where these actors were planning and creating their capabilities. But I think we have to remember these are advanced actors with advanced tradecraft. And that's, that they may have been simply a bridge too far. So to me, what this says is we have to do a better job of, intelligence collection against these adversaries to understand their intentions. And that means that Cyber Command is not, is an important stakeholder, but it's not the only stakeholder here. We need better public-private collaboration and improve sort of all source intelligence collection. And I think that's sort of where the failure is, less in sort of the failure of DefendOrg.
Thank you. As I said, when I saw you kind of talk about this before, I just thought it was, just really interesting points there, and really, helping us break that down and understand, the different stakeholders and all that. So, as you mentioned, it just, proves more of a need. And I don't think that, the strategy ever said, this is the end all be all, same thing with deterrence, right? And so I think it really does necessitate, as you're saying, as everyone is saying here, better defense, or really domestic, sort of defenses. And so I'd love if, if anyone wants to jump in here, but, I'll direct it to you, Erica, as well as Bruce, because Bruce, you've written about, the need for a defense dominant strategy. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on, if, where, cybercom with the military, it can't be just by law, it can't be everywhere. It can't, literally defend our entire nation, against these cyber operations, right? And, different government agencies, DHS, FBI, like, you can't do it all, right? The private sector obviously, has to play a huge role in this. So does state, government as well. So I'd love to get your thoughts on, sort of where we're going from here, and really what a defense dominant strategy, really looks like.
God, being muted in January is a rookie mistake in COVID. I see this very much as a failure of security regulation. So even before the attack, even before we have to defend, and the problem is that the infrastructure is insecure. And that's government infrastructure, corporate infrastructure, personal infrastructure, Internet of Things, everything. It's all one network, right? Flaws in your DVR can affect the national power grid. So what we have is a regulation-free space where companies can produce really poor security, shoddy stuff, sell it, buyers don't know, and what is ostensibly just the free market gives us national security vulnerabilities. And I think we want to look at it there. I mean, let's take a classic supply chain attack, right? 1982, Tylenol, right? Chicago, somebody, we actually don't know who, would buy bottles of Tylenol, add cyanide, put them back on the shelves, and then I think 7 people or so bought them and died. So that led to basically the invention of tamper-proof packaging. Right? What was decided is the way we're going to defend ourselves is by having more secure product. And really, that's what is missing. That, we talk about adding back doors. We talk about ways to keep these things vulnerable. But we really have to look at, on the internet, personal security, organizational security, corporate security is national security because it's all connected. And David's right that we don't know if this is espionage or attack. And the reason is they look exactly the same until the very last step, where the attacker either does copy *** or delete ***. And that difference is a millisecond. And as long as that's true, whether it's infrastructure like SolarWinds, whether it's our smartphones, whether it's Office 365, we're learning about those vulnerabilities that the Russians used. These all have to be made secure, and they're not going to be done so by the market. So that's where I see an enormous amount of policy should be focused on, is making this stuff better.
Bruce, quick question for you and the rest of the panelists. David's made the compelling case that this was a state-sponsored attack, but it exploited a vulnerability caused by sloppy practices, perhaps negligent practices. Is there a role for example, defective product liability law, for tort litigation, for the types of things that help correct markets and inherently unsafe products in other areas here?
There is a lot of people have written about how liabilities play a role here. My goal is to increase the costs to the companies for insecurity. The two basic ways to do this: one is liability, like we sue you if you have bad products. Second is regulation. We fine you if you have bad products. The details are going to be depending on your policy, and I'm a little bit agnostic there. But yes, now traditionally that's hard in software. We have largely exempted software from software liability. Right? Your spreadsheet loses a bunch of data and you lose money. You can't sue Microsoft. You can't sue Google Docs. So we kind of need to fix that. That is a little bit different than the Internet of Things, because it's an object, it's a car, it's a medical device, it's a toy, it's a vacuum cleaner, right? So it's a little bit different there. But yeah, liabilities does play a role. It's also often hard because traditionally courts have not viewed privacy violations as monetary harm. So I think there's some role for statutory damages. Right now, if you copy a Disney movie illegally, right, Disney doesn't have to prove that you profited off of that. There's an amount of damage you can be sued for and you have to pay. That is defined by law. So something like that for a privacy breach would go a long way. The devil's in the details here, but think about it is we need to raise the cost of producing insecure products.
Paul, there are two other elements. I agree with everything that Bruce said that I think are worth thinking about here. One of them is part of the brilliance of this attack was that it went after something that most people do to protect themselves against attacks, right? It went into the update system. Now, think about this in terms of the update you do most often, which is you put your phone by your bed overnight, you set it for, Apple to do the update. And, when that update comes in the morning, before you turn your phone on, you go through every line of code that Apple just gave you to make sure that it hasn't introduced a new vulnerability into your phone, right? Well, Bruce does that, but no one else on the panel does. Okay. So I
disagree. I bet Camille would do it too.
Oh, okay.
And I don't do it, so she's the only one who does it.
Okay. Camille, you'll have to tell us later on how one guards against this in your own personal life. One of the reasons you do the updates is to get rid of vulnerabilities. And so the brilliance of this was they put the vulnerability into the update. The second thing you can do if you're a company is you have to make an early decision. How are you going to go reveal when you've discovered a breach? So we had an interesting study in contrast here. On a Sunday night, just before this came out, Kevin Mandia and many of others at FireEye got a bunch of us on the phone and described what he had seen. And Microsoft did the same. We didn't have a similar conference call among the media and SolarWinds, right? We didn't have it with the cloud suppliers who it turned out were hosting the command and control center. So I would actually look at the liability in a different way. Look, vulnerabilities are going to happen. You can't make a car without defects. You can't make software without defects. But when it does, I think that we've got to design a system that rewards those who reveal it and punishes those who do not.
Yes,
a great point.
So I think there is a patchwork of legislation and policy that needs to happen that both David and Bruce have alluded to. We need national breach notification legislation, right? Like we need uniformity in when and how and where and why you need to notify the federal government, state actors, et cetera, of when you've had a breach. That must happen. We also need digital supply chain regulation. And some of that might be liability, as was asked about, and some of that will be that transparency, that those carrots and sticks pushing for transparency and requiring that. There is going to be a response from the private sector. They're all going to start looking at their supply chain, at least the responsible ones right now. But in a world where personal security is linked to national security, but the individual does not understand that linkage, you have to drive this in a more uniform way, because companies, the private sector, reacts to their customer base. They make demands of them. And if you have an uninformed populace, then they are not going to make the demands that make this a long-term investment rather than a reaction to something, right? So we have to incentivize that. We've talked a lot about DoD, but DHS has some work to do too. Einstein needs to be updated. These kinds of behavioral attacks should be layered on top of what Einstein is already detecting. Einstein's a system across the federal government that looks at the networks. That is not behavioral at all. It looks for malware code and then flags to the system that those signatures are available. We need to incentivize domestic innovation so that we have component parts that are made here, so people have choices in the market. Our strategy needs to articulate a way forward that considers supply chain, but also understands how that plugs into our critical infrastructure. So to David's point, no, we are unlikely to sign up for a norm prohibiting supply chain attacks, but we can advance the cyber norms on critical infrastructure and figure out where the line is there on where a supply chain attack moves into a critical infrastructure attack, and we will no longer accept that as an international community as something that's acceptable. And I think that there's progress that can be made there. So I think there's a lot of things to be done from a DHS perspective, from as we roll out the cyber strategy and a legislation perspective. Alex Stamos talked about a national transportation safety board type apparatus that collects all the information from everyone involved, similar to what Dave was talking about. They had this great call, but there were so many people missing from the call. That call should be happening in a concerted manner where that information can be used to apply lessons learned, feed the interagency, feed the private sector, and there could be some standardization around that kind of information collecting, and that should happen at DHS as part of CISA. So I'm eager to see how, as the National Cyber Directorate stands up, and as we think through what interagency cooperation looks like on these things, and as we work with Congress on legislation and work through how we will incentivize this kind of transparency and liability, what we can come up with, because there actually needs to be a lot of policy and legislation work to make sure that we can patch these holes.
And can I just add to that, Camille, you took the words out of my mouth about the National Cyber Director, because I think that, all of my colleagues on this panel are 100% correct in terms of the sort of the sticks and the carrots, the incentives and the regulations that need to happen, from both a government and a private sector perspective. I do think there has to be a champion at the most senior levels of government, particularly in coordinating on the defensive side, both across the interagency and with the key stakeholders in the private sector. And so not to give a shameless plug for the Solarium Commission, there are lots of different models for it, but at this point, we do have a Senate confirmed National Cyber Director position created in law in the 2021 NDAA. And so now it is incumbent upon the government to sort of empower that position and figure out what its roles and responsibilities are, how to coordinate and deconflict across the NSC with CISA and the Office of the National Cyber Director, and articulate a vision for what this sort of defensive coordinated sort of campaign planning looks like in that office. I have offense on the brain clearly, and total Freudian slip there. And how the National Cyber Director can help cultivate sort of the overall resilience of the nation in cyberspace. And I think that's, to me, a big unanswered question for the moment.
I think, both Camille and Erica, just brilliantly said there, on both your points. And Camille, I'm so glad you went into, what you said, and Erica too. One question I had, especially, as they're, the National Cyber Director, building their strategy, and looking at, these particular threats, if the government is using, these particular software systems, that have these vulnerabilities in there, is there something that you think we could address through, policy and legislative actions, on that aspect to potentially help increase, that resilience?
That's actually the easiest way to start demands on supply chain, right? If you are a federal vendor, you must meet these requirements. You must be able to articulate this level of transparency. Organizations have talked a lot about a bill of materials on the software side. You need to be able to tell me where every component of your software came from, whether it's open source or created in-house, how is it updated, how is it maintained, all of those things. That is an easy lift, doesn't require Congress, that we can implement policy to require that in the federal sector. And it can set a model. It could be a pilot, right? A test ground to figure out how companies meet that mark, how long it takes, what the incentives are to make sure that they are complying, where you'll need carrots, and what the gap will be to make this a cross ecosystem update that will permeate even just, private industry, irrespective of whether or not they plug into the federal system directly.
And that's interesting because that benefits everybody. If the government has an approved products list that meets all these standards, I, as a private network, can buy from that list. I mean, SolarWinds is not going to have two products, one for the federal government, the rest of us. They're going to meet the government's requirements, and that will be the product everybody gets. So the government now can increase security for everybody by just being a big purchaser and demanding changes like this. It's an easy win. It's a great win.
Think
Like
of
California
California
emission
emission standards. Yes.
Exactly right.
or Texas textbooks. It goes the other way too.
Absolutely. Well, I know we've had some really great discussion here, and I'm also really glad that you brought up the National Cyber Director as well. Here, we had a panel on this last week, and just really exciting to the work that the commission did to bring all this legislation forward, especially this role that can be that person, the face towards the public, but also coordinate the interagency is really exciting, and we're really looking forward to what that office does. So I think at this time we can open it up to some questions. We have a number of questions here, so we're going to try to get through those. Caitlin, do you have a couple ready to go?
Yeah, so the first question is for Dr. Borgard, was just asked by Samuel. Dr. Borgard, what do you believe the Biden administration should prioritize from the Solarium Commission most immediately?
Well, so this is, my personal opinion, but I think the National Cyber Director position is should be a priority. I commend the administration for sort of emphatically making cybersecurity a priority in the early days of the administration. And, I understand that it will take time to figure out sort of what that role looks like and to clarify roles and responsibilities and sort of figure out the organizational structure. There's 75 billets, it's a lot of people. So, with all of that, understood, I do think that it's clear to me that the NCD was one of the most significant recommendations of the commission. It does exist in law. And so moving the ball forward on that and articulating a vision for that office and a structure and a process and, adjudicating across different elements of the federal government, I think should be the top priority.
Thank you, Dr. Borgard. Our next question is from Gentry. APTs have infiltrated to install backdoors and monetized by investing venture capital in the very companies that purport to keep critical assets secure. Which agency does this problem belong to? Is this a Department of Commerce issue, Treasury, FBI or counter intel, DoD, cybercom? Is anyone working to assign accountability or punitive measures? Bruce, it looks like you want to answer that one.
I mean, I actually don't have an answer. I'm curious if somebody does. I think this is one of the problems. This kind of stuff falls through the cracks.
Does anyone else want to take a stab at that?
Well, you know, DHS, if you look at the formal structure, DHS should be, FBI, of course, follows the investigation issues here. It's DHS that of course deploys Einstein, as Erica pointed out. But again, they were all late to the game here, partly because of the way the Russians designed this. And part of the difficulty we're going to run into is every bad cyber actor learns from every other bad cyber actor like a really good student, right? So we have now revealed just how poor not only our supply chain security is, but our ability to detect supply chain breaches is. And the news that the Chinese were using this in some other way tells you something pretty important, which is that the two major cyber adversaries have identified this now as a primary way of attack. And I have not heard an American strategy to respond. Now, it is very good that President Biden asked Avril Haines, who's deeply engaged in these kinds of issues, to come up with a full assessment of what happened in SolarWinds. And my only hope is that rather than do the first thing that the intelligence community is tempted to do, which is come up with an assessment and immediately classify it for 25 years, which would make this completely useless, that they view this process more like what Alex Stamos suggested and was referred to before as a sort of National Transportation Safety Board go team. Because what happens after those teams, investigate a crash? They publish the result so that everybody around the world learns something from each incident. Right now, we haven't done that. There's no central place you can go to learn the lessons of Sony or learn the lessons of the Sands Casino hack or learn the lessons of Stuxnet. You have to sort of piece these together, which is great news for journalists like us who spend our time doing it, but not as useful for people who are trying to go actually have a compendium of lessons learned.
David, I would just add to that
And
very quickly that the government, a government, we're not going to see an unclassified version of it or just pablum that would come out. It will be a classified piece simply because of the purported Russian involvement. But second is it's going to be overwhelmingly focused on damage to impact on government networks. Very little will be focused on or ability to see into what's happening in the private sector, which I think is probably the bigger set of risks and damage. And I think just one example of that in the $10 billion that Biden has proposed for cybersecurity in recent bill. Over 90% of it is focused specifically on hardening government systems. It's really not focused on private sector, and I think it just shows that government is going to have a hard time thinking about anything other than government when it comes to the impact.
I want to add that
No, you had
CFIUS
a
should be looking. Yeah, CFIUS should be looking at this venture capital foreign investment piece that you mentioned, but they don't have the resources and the funding to proactively look for these things. So it's only when it comes to their attention, which is usually too late. And while CFIUS, the legislation that updated the regulation and allows them to have a broader breadth has been helpful, they are continuing to react to things, right? Let's roll that back, but the damage is already done if you've already owned a piece of a company for a year, 2 years by the time they roll it back. So Treasury does have a role in it. You mentioned that, and CFIUS should be a solution, but it definitely has to be better funded to proactively identify areas where foreign investment is happening in ways that are malicious and potentially harmful to national security.
I've heard this. I've heard, especially, say patents, when they're available, they can really go to anyone, right? So that's, I think, a really key factor in all of this.
Our next question is, what is the role of the government in using and not disclosing software vulnerabilities for defense or intelligence? Should we look at the vulnerabilities equities process to lean more towards defense?
My answer is yes, and it's very important for a whole lot of reasons, but I leave it to others to explain that more.
Yeah, maybe we should go over what the vulnerabilities equity process is really briefly before answering the question, just for those who might not know.
I say very quickly, it's about the offense-defense balance, right? If the NSA, the U.S. government, discovers a vulnerability in, I'm going to make this up, Microsoft Windows, they can do two things with it. They can use it to eavesdrop on our enemies, and at the same time and necessarily leaving us all vulnerable to someone else using that vulnerability. Or they can call up Microsoft and have it fixed, thereby improving all of our security, but also depriving themselves of the offensive benefit of using it. That is the dilemma, right? One world, one network, one answer. You pick whether you're going to use this for offense or use it for defense. And when I talk about a defense dominant strategy, what I want to say here is overwhelmingly, we need to use these for defense. As long as this infrastructure is being used by state, local governments, as long as phones are in the pockets of every CEO and nuclear power plant operator and election official and judge and police officer, that we must err on the side of defense. It is much more important for our security.
I'd only add to that we lost track of this process a little bit in the Trump years. In the Obama, just modestly, right? In the Obama era, they wouldn't tell us much, but at least they annually would come out and say, we looked at a universe of vulnerabilities and we reported 90% of them. That was sort of the general number that they used to private industry, much of it to Microsoft, right? Which means what they're saying is they kept 10% aside for use in future cyber weapons. Then came the giant embarrassment of losing American offensive cyber weapons, which ended up being used in the NotPetya attack, one of the broadest attacks until SolarWinds came along, used in the North Korean attack that took out the, unintentionally, I think, the British healthcare system and so forth. And then all of a sudden, the US kind of went silent on it because it would be a little embarrassing to answer the question, so why did you keep this secret until it got stolen? And then you showed up to Microsoft and gave them about 30 days to go try to get this fixed around the world before it turned out that the North Koreans and the Russians all used it. And at that moment, the NSA kind of clamped down. I would, by law, require some regular reporting on at least on the percentages and maybe on the numbers that are being kept out as a way to sort of guide this whole system and then explain who's responsible for it. Now, in the new White House structure, where they've brought Ann Neuberger in to be running the White House, she would be a very natural place for that to reside. And given her history at the NSA, I think she'd probably have a really good sensibility about it. Since she's worked on both the offense and defense side, but you could imagine many other structures. We need a lot more visibility into this.
All right, our next question calls for a little bit of speculation. If this event was not limited to espionage, what are the Russians likely to do next? Does Russia now have a deterrence tool against the US since it's very difficult to fully quantify everything the SVR may have infiltrated?
I take a shot. I would say yes. I mean, so what happens in this attack is you are the actor. You get in via SolarWinds, via Office 360. You immediately move laterally, add other vulnerabilities, add other ways to get in. You bury deep into the networks that you have infiltrated. And likely the Russians have buried very deep into the networks. We don't know which networks. We don't know how deep. We don't know how. Now, what can be done, right? I mean, the line between intelligence and offense is very fine. Deleting data, changing data, disrupting operations. I mean, all the things you can imagine you can do if you control a computer or network. And now, yes, we do not know where the Russians are. And I mean, unless we actively burn the network to the ground and rebuild it, which we will never do, we will never know. For sure. And that is, I think, an extraordinary deterrence. I mean, I'll punt to David to talk about how this is a deterrent effect. But to me, this is one of the most troublesome things.
I think Erica had a quick point on that too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess I agree that we don't know. I also think the other unknown is we don't know what we might be holding at risk as well. When it comes to cyber deterrence, which is a concept that has, I think, different meanings to different audiences. I think at least our track record has been relatively positive at deterring really significant cyber attacks. And I think the problem with talking about deterrence outcomes is that they're a null result. And so it's really hard to tease out what sort of the explanatory factors were that led to it. And so I guess I'll just pile on and say there are a lot of unknowns. I also think that this, it is important to debate about, and actually not just debate, but seek intelligence on what the ultimate motivations of Russia are. But, I think this should remind us that cyber is an instrument of statecraft. And so these types of things don't happen in a vacuum. There's a political element to it. So I think it's important to also ask, like, why might Russia seek to conduct a destructive cyber attack, kind of weaponizing this vulnerability? And so I think getting at those questions is really important in being able to understand the extent to which we might be deterred, or vice versa, might be deterring Russia from sort of a follow-on attack.
I think that's a great point too, and goes to the need for us to have understanding on sort of both sides of the classified intelligence, with, like you're saying, the strategic intent and capabilities and things like that, and also having visibility into those operations, both, like you said, in red, gray, and blue space, for our nation. So,
Lauren, imagine for a moment you are President Biden and you're getting ready to go do sanctions against Russia for Navalny, for SolarWinds, for the next 3 things that Vladimir Putin's going to do that we haven't imagined yet, okay? And someone comes by and says, sir, before we slap that on, can we just remind you that we don't know how deeply they are in our systems, and so we can't really give you an assessment of how they're going to go respond? And I don't know, Paul, you spent a lot of time in meetings like this at various points. What do you say to a president or a secretary of state or someone else making that decision at that time?
Well, and what makes that risk gain calculation so hard is you don't actually know what's at risk. And then the same thing why deterrence is so hard in cyberspace is the other side doesn't know what you hold at risk. We might know what we could take out. They don't know what we could take out, so they can't make a rational calculation. So I think that's why cyber issues are so fundamentally destabilizing and dangerous, because you don't have that transparency and calculus that let you weigh up the risks of nuclear war, for example, or conventional conflict.
And not only that too, but I think we focused a lot on some of the government systems here, but I think we also need to remember that a lot of critical infrastructure was also impacted, operational systems, et cetera. And so the surface is really broad, and I think if we were to say, well, what might happen, I think if we look to previous operations, we potentially could get some indication there, say in Ukraine, et cetera. So it's a really, I think, important point to make.
And also that this is international. It's not just the US. Already we've seen networks in Canada, Mexico, Belgium, Spain, the UK, Israel, UAE. This is worldwide. We're focusing on the US, but other countries and organizations are grappling with this as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have about 5 minutes, so we'll have 1 or 2 more questions. So the next question is from Michael Miner, who is an associate with the Intelligence Project and co-teaches a course at the Extension School on cyber. A perennial lesson throughout history is that adversaries operating in the intelligence and cyber world are most active where we are not looking. As David pointed out, the NSA does not have the authority for good reason to look inward. Others missed the signs. SolarWinds was not the first time and likely won't be the last. Question 1, where should we be looking in the future where we are not now? And 2, how do we better integrate capabilities to mitigate the foreign domestic divide?
I'll just say this real quick. This is definitely an area that, we're really looking at between, this project on looking at, coordinated cyber operations and cyber threat intelligence analysis and sharing. What are those barriers and how we can do this better. But yeah, happy to kick it over to someone else too for other thoughts.
I mean, I could jump in and talk a little bit about some of the pilot programs that that were started a couple years ago with Cyber Command and Treasury, DHS, FBI, NSA, and critical infrastructure. So I think there's a recognition that every stakeholder here sees like one piece of the puzzle, right? And no one has a complete understanding of what the threat environment looks like. And so I think it was in 2017, there was this pilot program developed called Project Indigo, which involved collaboration between some elements of the financial services sector, which is one of the sort of 16 or so critical infrastructure sectors designated by executive order, Cyber Command and other departments and agencies in the federal government to figure out how to kind of pilot not only sort of information sharing, but also some training and like shared analytics and things like that. And, obviously that's just a pilot. It's grown since then into Pathfinder programs with not just the financial services sector, but also energy. And so there are sort of versions of these kind of experiments that try to figure out how to bridge not only the public-private divide, but also the different silos across the federal government. I think this made it into the NDAA, but there was a Solarium recommendation about sort of doing a report on the success of these kinds of programs and lessons learned and how they could be institutionalized and sort of expanded. And so I just offer that as a model, right? Like not necessarily the right one, but I do think there is a recognition that this is a challenge.
All right. So we're almost at time. So, I'd love to offer the opportunity if you want to do like a 1 minute, final thought. And then, as we look to wrap up, I invite anyone to just jump in if they'd like to.
Well, Lauren, I think you've demonstrated here in an hour and a quarter why this is going to be the full employment act for cyber scholars, cyber journalists, I see Erica clapping, yes, for years to come, because it involves really 3 levels of inquiry. First, what happened? And I don't think we're going to know for a long time if we ever really fully know. Second question out of all that is, what do you do to prevent that from going on in the future? In our discussion about everything from standards to corporate disclosure and all that is a piece of it. And then the third, which Camille and Erica brought up so well, which is, what does this tell you about what we've been trying on deterrence? And what it tells you is we're 10 years into this deterrence thing, basically, since the time that we were first saying that almost everything that you learned about nuclear deterrence doesn't apply when it comes to cyber. And yet I can't say that we've come up with much of an answer here. I mean, if in fact we haven't raised the cost enough that Putin and others think that this was a free and easy one to do, then clearly we haven't come up with the magic formula.
I'll just add that our lack of action on the policy front is also going to continue to limit us as we try to respond to these things. Supply chain attacks are not new. Deficiencies in our defenses, like Einstein, are not new. We were talking about that when I was at DHS 5 years ago. You know, we must work together to fill the gaps that we've identified. The threat will always change. We cannot fully raise the cost enough, to David's point, if we're unwilling to impose the costs, the full breadth of the costs. And we also need to continue to invest in that trust dynamic with industry, because that will help with that domestic international line. It will help with the public-private line. And we just have to invest in those areas. And so I'm eager to see how this administration takes the time to support the National Cyber Director, building that office, but also building the connective tissue throughout the interagency and the private sector, such that that could be a successful endeavor. And I encourage them to take the time that that takes to do that well, because everything else would be a lot easier in the wake of
that. And more generally, this supply chain problem is in a lot of ways insurmountably hard. We are deeply, deeply international. There's no way. One of the questioners asked about, can we just balkanize? We can't. It's too late. You know, our equipment comes from all over the world. Our programmers come from all over the world. I mean, someone asked another question about, you know, whether China and Russia have better supply chains because they're not a market economy. They have the same one. I mean, they're using SolarWinds just like we are. Everyone uses the same stuff. And it's a very complex problem. When we can pick at pieces of it, we can talk about, should we trust Chinese networking equipment? Should we trust Russian antivirus equipment? But, you know, an iPhone isn't made in the US. SolarWinds is a US company owned by a Brazilian billionaire. That's the way the world is. And this international nature is going to make this very, very hard at the national security level and at the consumer security level and everything in between.
Okay, I'll offer a quick thought because we're well over time, but I would throw out to the group, if deterrence isn't quite the right framework for most of the challenges we face in cyberspace, maybe we should consider other frameworks that might be more applicable. I think the idea of resilience, which you know, obviously, Camille has done a lot of work on, but I think assuming disruption and assuming compromise and not aiming to sort of alter the calculus of the adversary and just, you know, focus instead on sort of anticipating and preparing for and being better prepared for those inevitable events is probably the right approach.
Wow. Thank you everyone so much. All this discussion and these questions, they were really wonderful to help, I think, understand this issue further, especially, you know, from the lens of you know, where do we go from here in our defense and everything. So Camille, Erica, David, Bruce, and Paul and Caitlin, of course, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to the audience. This was great. And I look forward to working with you more and seeing what we can all do. So thank you, and everyone be well and safe out there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.